Snow pressed heavy against the slopes of the high mountains, muffling the world in a silence so complete it could almost be mistaken for eternity. A lone cabin stood there, its timbers weathered by countless storms, smoke rising in a thin ribbon from a chimney that looked ready to crumble. Inside, the air was stale with sickness, the embers in the hearth struggling to hold their glow. A woman lay curled near the fire, her body folded as though the weight of living had finally become too much to bear. Her hand clutched at her swollen belly, the trembling of her fingers betraying both fever and fear. Her name was Clara May, a schoolteacher once, and once beloved. She had taught children their letters and numbers, sung hymns softly at the church socials, and worn dresses neat and simple. But all of that felt like another lifetime. It had ended the moment gossip caught flame, spreading through her small town like prairie fire. She had carried a child without a husband, and in the eyes of neighbors, that alone was sin enough to erase every kindness she had ever given. They whispered her name like a curse, mothers pulling their daughters close when she passed. Even the pastor's wife, once her confidant, avoided her eyes in the marketplace. The shame clung heavier than her fever now, heavier than the child pressing within her. Clara May had fled the judging eyes, trading them for wilderness. At first, she believed herself strong enough to outlast the storms. She chopped wood with blistered hands, fetched water from the frozen creek, learned to trap rabbits though she gagged at skinning them. But the mountains ask more of a soul than defiance, and when winter came biting, she could no longer keep pace. Fever crept into her lungs, hunger gnawed her bones, and each night she feared it would be the last for her and the tiny life within her. Alone in that cabin, she waited for either mercy or death, unsure which would come first. It was Elias Boone who found her. He was a man of broad shoulders and quiet steps, with a beard coarse for months without shaving and eyes that held more shadows than light. Elias was not one to go seeking company. He had carved a life on the ridges and rivers, trapping and hunting, moving with the seasons. The town at the base of the valley knew him, but only as a figure glimpsed at distance. The mountain man who came down once in a while for salt, bullets, and flour, then vanished again. Whispers said he carried scars from the war, scars too deep to live among men. Whatever his past, Elias carried it silently, choosing the company of trees and streams over words. That day, he was following tracks of elk across a ridge when a faint smoke caught his eye. It curled uncertainly, a thread nearly torn by the wind. In winter, smoke could mean survival or dying. He turned his path toward it. The cabin looked ready to collapse, snow packed against its door. When he stepped inside, cold air rushed in with him, and what he saw halted his breath. Clara May lay slumped near the hearth, lips pale as candle wax, her hair damp with sweat. Her eyes fluttered half open, registering the intruder, then drifted shut again. She was little more than skin and bone wrapped around the swell of her belly. For a long moment Elias stood still, the old instinct to turn away rising in him. Other people's troubles had burned him before. But then her hand twitched weakly over her child, a gesture of protection even in near unconsciousness, and something in his chest shifted. He stepped forward. The first thing he did was feed the fire, stacking split logs until flames climbed strong again. He pulled his own coat from his shoulders, laying it across her. She stirred at the weight, whispering a sound that wasn't quite a word. He fetched water from a bucket by the door, lifting her head gently and coaxing a swallow between her cracked lips. She coughed, but her eyes opened a little wider, clearer now, staring into his face with something between terror and disbelief. "Don't," she rasped, barely audible. "Don't mock me." Elias frowned, unsure if he had heard right. "Don't call me ruined," she breathed, voice trailing. He shook his head slowly, speaking for the first time. His voice was low, gravel-edged from disuse. "No one deserves the cold." Her eyes glistened, though she turned her face away as if ashamed of the tears. Elias asked nothing more. Instead he set himself to work. He chopped wood outside until his arms ached, boiled broth from the scraps of rabbit jerky in his pack, spread a clean cloth on her forehead. Clara May watched in silence, each act both comfort and wound. Kindness was harder to bear than cruelty. It reminded her of how far she had fallen. In the days that followed, Elias came and went between his own cabin and hers, carrying herbs, blankets, and venison. Clara May grew stronger in body, though the sickness clung stubbornly. She spoke little, but in quiet moments, when he adjusted the quilt or steadied her cup, her eyes softened. She noticed the way he never lingered too close, as though he understood her fragility. She noticed, too, the gentleness with which his rough hands moved, hands built for traps and rifles, yet capable of tenderness. One evening, as wind moaned around the cabin, she asked, "Why do you help me?" Her voice was thin, her breath labored. Elias stirred the fire, sparks jumping. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said, "Because you're still here." That night, Clara May cried silently while he mended the draft at the window. She had expected ridicule, or indifference at best. Yet here was a man who offered neither, only presence. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. It stirred hope, and hope was dangerous. By the end of a week, her cheeks held a hint of color. She could sit upright, could whisper thanks without losing breath. Still, shame shadowed every word. The memory of townsfolk spitting her name lingered sharp. She knew the world beyond this cabin would not forgive. Yet in Elias's silence, there was no condemnation. Only an unspoken truth. Survival mattered more than judgment. On the seventh night, snow fell heavy again. Clara May watched the flakes drift through the cracks in the shutters. She placed her hand over her belly and whispered to the life inside, "We're not alone anymore." Elias, tending the fire, looked up at her words. Their eyes met across the flicker of flame, and for the first time, she did not look away. Something passed there, delicate as a spark carried on breath. And so the cabin that had seemed destined to be her grave became a place of fragile beginning. The sickness had not released her fully, and hunger still gnawed, but the certainty of death had lifted. In its place stood a fragile thread of connection, spun between two souls who had both been cast aside, yet found themselves drawn together by necessity, and perhaps something more. Clara May drifted into sleep that night with a faint smile on her lips, her hand still resting on her belly. Elias sat near the hearth, silent as ever, though his gaze lingered on her longer than before. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, for the first time in many months, warmth had returned. The firelight painted the room in amber, and though neither spoke of it, they both felt the truth settling between them. Survival had brought them into each other's orbit, but it was something deeper that would decide what came next. The fever did not leave quietly. It clung to Clara May in waves, surging through her body until her nights became a blur of pain and sweat. Each time she thought she had outlasted it, it returned fiercer, stealing her breath, pressing down on her chest as though to remind her she had no right to hope. Yet she was not alone now. When her cries rose in the dark, Elias Boone was there, sitting at her side, his shadow long against the wall. He spoke little, but his hands were steady, cooling her brow with cloths dipped in snowmelt, holding a cup of bitter willow bark tea to her lips. It was not grand devotion, only small acts performed without hesitation, but to Clara it felt like the difference between life and the grave. In the haze of fever, she confessed fragments of her story. How the whispers had followed her, how each friend had turned, how even her own kin had told her she had brought ruin upon herself. The words spilled out not in speeches but in broken sentences between shivers, a release she had not known she needed. Elias listened without flinching, never offering judgment, only silence that felt strangely like acceptance. She wondered at that silence. It unsettled her as much as it comforted her, for it meant she could not hide behind argument or defiance. Her shame simply existed between them, and yet he did not turn away. One night, the pain in her belly came sudden and sharp, unlike the fever aches she had endured before. Elias's head jerked up from where he sat by the fire as she clutched at her side, gasping. He moved to her quickly, his expression unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. She was too weak for labor, and yet it had come. The storm outside was unrelenting, snow whipping against the shutters, the mountains swallowing any chance of fetching help. In that moment the cabin became the whole of their world, and the child pressing to be born demanded all of it. The hours that followed blurred into a trial of endurance. Clara cried out until her voice broke, her hands gripping Elias's with desperate strength. He had delivered no child before, yet he faced the moment as he had once faced battle, steady, unyielding, his every movement deliberate. He heated water, tore strips of linen, whispered rough words of encouragement whenever her strength faltered. At times he thought she would not survive, her skin turned gray, her breaths shallow. Yet each time she seemed to slip, she clawed back, driven by something greater than herself, the stubborn will to see her child live. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the cabin in stark flashes. In one such burst Elias saw her face, sweat and tears mingling, eyes wide with terror yet burning with determination. He thought of himself then, of nights after the war when he had wished not to wake, when he had chosen silence and solitude rather than risk the cruelty of men. Looking at Clara, he recognized the same battle, the same fight against the voice that said life was no longer worth clinging to. And he knew he could not let her lose. When dawn finally broke, the cries of a newborn filled the cabin, thin but insistent, a sound sharp enough to split the silence of the mountains. Clara collapsed back against the bedding, too exhausted to move, her chest rising shallowly. Elias held the child briefly in his large, calloused hands, startled by the fragility of the life he now cradled. The infant's fists clenched, its mouth open in protest at the cold, and something in Elias's chest tightened with a feeling he had not known in years. He wrapped the child carefully in cloth and placed it into Clara's waiting arms. Her eyes opened just enough to see, and when they did, a sob broke from her lips. She held the baby close, whispering through tears, "She's breathing, she's breathing." Her voice was hoarse but filled with awe. Elias watched, silent, but his gaze lingered on the pair as though witnessing something sacred. In that fragile moment, the shame of gossip and exile seemed far away. What existed in the cabin was only survival, only life renewed. The days that followed were gentler. Clara slept often, her strength slowly returning. Elias kept the fire alive, cooked what little food they had, and ventured out during breaks in the storm to hunt. Each time he returned, he paused at the threshold before stepping inside, as though aware the sight of him entering with snow still clinging to his shoulders meant safety had not abandoned her. She began to notice his quiet rituals. How he checked the rafters for leaks, how he always placed the water bucket close by before nightfall, how he kept his rifle within reach but never in her sideline, as if shielding her from any reminder of violence. One afternoon, as she nursed the child, a rider appeared on the trail. Clara stiffened at the sound of hooves, fear prickling her skin. Elias stepped outside before the knock came, his body filling the doorway. The man was from town, a neighbor she recognized even at distance. His gaze slid past Elias to where Clara sat, and his lips curled with the same disdain she had fled months ago. He muttered words sharp as knives, questioning her virtue, sneering at her disgrace. For a moment, the shame surged back, wrapping around Clara's heart. But Elias did not move aside. He stood firm, voice low but ironbound. "This cabin is no place for gossip," he said, each word deliberate. "Only for the living." The rider shifted uncomfortably, unprepared for such quiet defiance. With a scoff, he turned his horse and disappeared down the trail. Elias stepped back inside without a word, but Clara saw the way his jaw was set, the way his shoulders remained taut long after. He had carried her shame on his own back, shielding her without ever naming it. That evening, as the fire warmed the cabin and the child slept between them, Clara looked at Elias fully. Her voice was rough from weakness, but steady. "You breathed us back," she said. He did not answer, but his eyes met hers, and in them she saw a promise he did not yet know how to speak aloud. The mountains outside remained cruel, the storms relentless, the world beyond still filled with judgment. Yet inside the cabin, something had shifted. Clara no longer felt like a woman waiting for death. She felt like a mother, alive with purpose. Elias no longer seemed only a solitary figure of the wilderness, but a man tethered now to more than silence. And so the cabin that had been her refuge from shame, her sickbed, and nearly her grave, became instead the birthplace of a fragile hope. The firelight flickered across their faces, tracing lines of fatigue and quiet resolve. Neither dared call it love, not yet, but both knew the truth. In saving her, he had saved himself, and in surviving, she had given him reason to remain. The storm outside could rage as it pleased. Within those walls, warmth endured, carrying them into whatever awaited beyond the dawn.